Gotta say, I'm not very happy with the autofocusing performance on this lens because it doesn't have any. But you know, I'm old. I remember a time when that's all we had. Welcome back, DPReview viewers. It is Chris Nichols here, and you know, we always review a lot of very expensive lenses on our show, but today we're going to change things up. We wanted to look at something that's an affordable third-party lens. We're looking at the 7Artisans 55mm 1.4. This is only $125 USD. Now, this is an APS-C lens made for various mounts. It's going to convert to roughly an 80-85mm focal range, one of my favorites, and it is absolutely with a very bright aperture, so it should be fun today. Now, today we are shooting on a Nikon Z7. This is what we have available. It's a full frame. I know we're cropping it to DX, but it is an excellent sensor. Still plenty of resolution. We're out in the mountains in Canmore. I think we'll have a fun day today. Now, considering how affordable this lens is, we're not going to get a lot of bells and whistles, but construction on it is good. It's got a strong metal helicoid with a fairly smooth manual focusing ring, maybe a little bit on the lighter side, but it's not sloppy at all. The aperture ring, though, because of the low cost, you can't choose to make it clickable or non-clickable. It's just a smooth turning aperture ring. It's not ideal for photography, but it still works. But I think this was really a concession to also make it useful for anybody wanting to use this lens for video applications. I like the fact that we've got a 52mm filter thread. There's lots of filters like that on the market, and I also like the fact that we've got very clear depth of field indicators on this lens. So overall, for the price point, pretty good. So when doing close-up work, our minimum distance is about 1.5 feet. Not tremendously good macro capability. Certainly nice for like tight portrait shots, but you're not going to get any closer than an entire face. But at the same time, it's only $150 Canadian, which is, to give you context, about the same as a month of internet and cell phone. So who needs the internet and cell phone for a month, right? Turn that off and then you got a lens to play with for that 30 days. So one of the major downsides with getting a lens this affordable is it's very simple, sometimes a little bit too simple. I mean, manual focus, fine, okay. But I'm also not going to get any aperture EXIF data going to my files. I have to come up with a clever way to make sure I remember what apertures I shot so that you guys have that data for the files that you can download. And also things like IBIS. If I'm going to use image stabilization in the body, I got to make sure I program in the right focal length. I mean, it does demand a little bit of extra work from you as the photographer when you're using these lenses. Now for video work, this lens does have some potential. You know, as you mentioned, the manual focus is nice and smooth and the aperture ring doesn't click. So those are all positives, but unfortunately, there's quite a bit of breathing on this lens. So as you do a focus pull or transition, you're gonna see your focal length change quite a bit. But it is only $125. I mean, that's basically me filling my Acura MDX gas tank. So I just walk for a week instead and I can have this lens. So as you can see, the snow is going sideways because the weather's really gone to shit. So we're not really going to get any flare or Bokeh tests here today, but we will go home. We'll take some more samples. When we see you again, we'll have a chance to look at the files. We'll talk about the rest of the things we think about this lens. All right, so we've had a chance to look at the files that we shot. We've taken some more samples, so let's talk about the rest of this lens. Now, flare first. We didn't get a lot of sunlight in the last week, but there were some moments where it broke out, and honestly, I was actually very pleased with the flare performance on the 55mm, and I didn't really notice any major ghosting or reflections, so it actually handled that quite well. Now, chromatic aberrations. This lens definitely has chromatic aberrations. You'll often see purple color fringing. However, keep in mind that a lot of lenses do have chromatic aberrations, and when linked up to an appropriate body, the camera automatically profiles these out. They're corrected in your JPEGs and easy to fix in your RAWs. Now, the 7Artisans doesn't have any camera communication, so we would expect to see chromatic aberrations show up, and it's very easy to fix, so I'm not worried about that. But we also talk about LOCA, longitudinal chromatic aberration, and this is where you get those color fringes in the foreground and background out of focus areas. Often you're going to see a split between like a cyan or green to magenta kind of shade. shift. And as you can see in this example here, it's definitely there. The out of focus areas in the background and foreground, you can see very distinct green or magenta color cast. And this is something that you cannot easily fix in post. That's unfortunate, and you're gonna see it a lot when you have high contrast areas out of focus. All right, it's time to break down bokeh. Let's start with specular highlights first. Now, when you shoot at 1.4, you will notice heavy cat's eye, so much so that it's actually quite beautiful, and it can be really kind of a unique look. Your subjects are gonna have very interesting swirly corners. It can be quite beautiful when you use the frames properly. Now, when you stop down to F2, you actually reduce the cat's eye quite a bit. You can see there's still some, but things start to just, behave a little bit better. And by the time you get to 2.8, the cat's eye is basically gone. I also was very impressed that specular highlights are quite clean. Didn't really notice a lot of onion rings, nice smooth kind of look to them, which was nice. They do still at 2.8 have a polygonal look to them, but honestly, it just kind of looks old school, and I was really pleased with how this lens renders specular highlights. Now, when it comes to how that bokeh transitions from in focus to out of focus areas, it's a tricky one, because when I was shooting portraits and stuff up close, I actually really like the way that it transitions from in focus to out of focus. It looks quite subtle. I like the way that cheeks kind of fall away and the hair falls away. But when I was shooting other things, I don't know, there's something about it that I just found a little bit off-putting. I found that the transition was maybe a little bit harsh and a little bit distracting, but I know I'm being a little wishy-washy on it. Bokeh is very subjective. It could have just been the situation I was shooting in. At least in those situations, there's something about it that just kind of turned me off. And so this is an interesting lens. I do like the way the bokeh transitions in certain situations, and the specular highlights were better than I expected. So I wasn't sure what to expect when it comes to sharpness out of such an affordable lens. And again, this lens has character. There's some interesting quirks here. So when shooting wide open at 1.4, you can see here on the chart, there's detail, but there's also this general loss of contrast and this haziness, which really offsets that detail and gives you a fairly overall soft look. When you take a look at this portrait shot at 1.4, you can see that you do have detail in the eyes, but there's this sort of loss of contrast, which actually works well for portraits. Now let's take a look at the same portrait, but shot at 2.8. Now you can see it changes quite a bit. We get rid of that loss of contrast and it crisps up quite nicely. When we go back to the chart at 2.8, you can see that that same thing follows here. It actually has quite good detail, very comparable to more expensive 85mm lenses. There's a quirk though with the 7Artisans lens. It's got heavy field curvature, and you really got to pay attention to this when you're taking photos. Now, normally more expensive 85mm lenses correct for field curvature somewhat, and that means that if I take something like the test chart, which is flat, and I focus in the center, the corners might not be as sharp, but they're still basically on the same plane of focus. But you can see here when shooting on the 7Artisans, focused in the center, the corners are way out of focus. And then I do another example where I then focus in the corner specifically. Well, they tighten up quite nicely, but now look at the centers. They're way out. So what this means is, first off, you cannot expect to focus on something in the center and have the corners be sharp as well, even when you stop down the lens. And you definitely have to pay attention to where you're focusing. If I was shooting a portrait and the eyes are higher up in the frame, I absolutely have to get my composition set, move the focus point up, for example, on a mirrorless camera to the eyes, punch in and focus there specifically to make sure that they're sharp. Anywhere you want this lens in focus, make sure you're specifically focusing in that area. So the 7Artisans 55mm, this is not a boring lens. There's a lot going on here. It's got a lot of character, but it's also got a lot of quirks and even some pitfalls. And I think at the low price point, a lot of beginners might be tempted to just kind of get into an all-around 85mm lens here, and I don't think that's what this lens is. Could be a kind of frustrating experience, but if you know what you're doing here, or if you're used to the characteristics with this lens, it actually has a lot of interesting potential. I definitely would like it for things like portraits, where that dreamy soft look works. I like, out of focus highlights in the background could be really interesting in shots as well. And I think primarily this lens is an awesome portrait kind of lens. For other work, as long as you're aware of things like the chromatic aberrations and the Bokeh and those definitely soft corners and big heavy field curvature, you can get some interesting results, but you really got to be aware of what's going on. So hopefully this lens and this review will help you kind of get past some of those pitfalls and quirks and decide if this lens is right for you. We always appreciate you guys joining us. Leave your comments below in the section there, and do check out our sample gallery. That link is in the description below as well. Like our channel, please subscribe as well. We'd appreciate that. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you again for another episode of Deep Review TV.